Hello, good afternoon. My name is Matthijs de Bruijne. I'm a bit the central person today and it feels a bit uncomfortable. But I have to say first that I'm really grateful what I could do here. And I'm very grateful for the help of the team of BAC, especially Maria and Matteo, who did such a great job. And of course, maybe if you walk in, you don't see it, but yesterday, I think you hit it. What time did you went home? 1 o'clock? 12, okay, 12, only 12. In the last week, there had been so many weird machines in this place, and in the meanwhile, the staff of BAC was working here like hell. I'm really grateful for that, and it was an amazing job, what you have done. First, I will introduce a guest we have today with us. I met her the first time, I think it was in April 2003. It was in the Avenida Corrientes, I think, and it was Andreas Siegmann who introduced me to Graciela Carnevale. And it was at that moment the start of what later became the project Ex-Argentina. But in the months before that meeting, I stayed in a soup kitchen in the province of Tucumán. There's a province in the northwest of Argentina, a province with a chronic unemployment and poverty. What means in times of a crisis, malnutrition and child mortality. How did I get there? I think it were the... I was invited to go there by the cartoneros. Maybe some of you have seen the project Liquidación in the exhibition. The people I worked with in Buenos Aires invited me what they called for a holiday. But of course it was also quite clear that they wanted me to take my European camera with me. To show how the situation at that moment was in Tucumán, because it was a situation that really shocked me, I have to say. It was a poverty that I've never seen in Europe till that time, I have to say, because I'm talking about 2003 and now I think we are 2018, and especially in the south of Europe, we have seen crises what are quite similar to what had happened in Argentina. But in that bar, when I had that meeting, the first meeting with Graciela, I showed her the photos I took in Tucumán. And for Graciela, it was quite a surprise that these photos were nearly the same as she took at that moment 35 years ago. Because in 1968, she went as part of a collective with many artists. The collective was called Tucumán Arde, to the same province, to Tucumán. Till in the 60s, the sugar used to be the main product in that province, and it was in 1966 that the military government of Oncanía closed the sugar mills in that province and left the people to their fate. So this population of Tucumán was without any job at that moment, and they impoverished quickly. The normal thing, maybe you could say, if you talk about military governments, was that the only thing what the government did was starting a campaign to cover up the situation in the province. A province what they called El Jardín de la República, the Garden of the Republic. The collective Tucumán Arde, what means Tucumán Burns, went to the province to support the campaign of the trade union CGT de los Argentinos. What was a radical trade union at that moment. Tucumán Arde started a counter-campaign to show the reality in what they called the Garden of Misery. And the sad thing I have to tell you right now is that the difference between 68 and 2003 when we met, and maybe, I don't know how the situation is at this moment, but Actually, you could say the situation didn't improve, because you could say in 2003 the photos look the same as the photos you took in '68. Personally, for me as an artist, the history of Tucumán Arde has been since that meeting crucial, I have to say. Is it possible to produce an artwork that produces an effect similar to that of a political action? I ask now in question, but in '68 it was not a question, it was a step that a group of artists in Argentina took. It's a very long travel from Rosario, where you live in Argentina, to the Netherlands. It's a travel of more than 20 hours. So I'm very pleased to welcome you, Graciela, here in Utrecht. And I really want to thank you for traveling so many hours. And humbly, I would like to ask you, please, could you tell us about your experience that took place now 50 years ago?
Well, thank you, Matthijs, and thank you back and Cecilia and all the people who made possible my being here and have this opportunity to talk with you and have a conversation about an experience that was very important and is still important in my life, because it gave rise to processes of subjectivation that allowed me to approach some issues and to think of artistic practice as a disruptive action on reality. Tucumán Arde was a collective and interdisciplinary work. It was conceived as a denounce, an action of counter-information to make known the real social situation in Tucumán, produced by the closure of the sugar mills due to the economic policies implemented by the military government that was in power. For this, we imagine a complex and ambitious project that developed over time in several stages and in different territories. The first part consisted in a trip to Tucumán. The second, a publicity campaign. The third, an exhibition in the Central Union Workers. And the fourth, that never took place, was a compilation and a publication of the event or the project. In the mid-60s, in a hostile and repressive context of a military dictatorship, Tucumán Arde and the Vanguardia art group questioned the role of the artist and the art. At the moment of the deployment of radical ideas that traveled the world and installed the possibility of a revolution, our practices and productions entered into contradiction and conflict with our convictions, and forced us to think of the artist as an agent of change immersed in the conflicts of society, and art as a tool of social transformation. For this, it was necessary to define new concepts and imagine new strategies and formats, new materials, and look for other spaces and other audiences to address, leaving aside a romantic and contemplative conception of art, to insert our doing in everyday life in the search for new ways of living. The group was the engine that allowed us to build an alternative thinking and experience the concept of art as living in artistic practice. Today, Tucumán is a mythical work that has acquired a visibility that we never imagined due to a series of highly disruptive innovations for the time. We are going to show now some images of the first part of this work that consisted in the in all the the photos we registered of the situation there.
We showed them already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You were showing. Yeah. Sorry. I didn't.
Do you want to take another look at the pictures and maybe give some extra explanation to some of the photos?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
You want to tell something about it?
I think you can see. No, it's okay. Well, you may. Well, I think these images tell you about what were the real conditions of living of people, and also about the houses, the poverty, the working conditions in the fields where all the family work for a little money, the problems that this brings about illness, also the scholar desertion, and also famine. And at the moment was also a great problem with children dying for famine, starvation. I don't know. ¿Ya está bien?
Thank you very much, Graciela. Matthijs and Graciela, there is a resonance between the times in which you were working in Tucumán, and I think we can say there is a resonance also between not only 68, 2003, but also 2018, not only across time, but also across space. There is a certain period of crisis going on, not only in Latin America, but also in Europe nowadays. Matthijs, in preparation of this day, you said in 2003, when I was in Argentina, people in Europe never imagined that something like that, what they were living over there, could happen with us Europeans over here. Nowadays, we think very different about that, of course. So I would like to ask you both to reflect on what you say, the role as the artist, as an agent of change in a time of crisis like that. Thinking of these 3 different periods of time, maybe 68, 2003, 2018. What were the differences and the similarities of the possibility that the artist could have in that situation?
Well, I think there are those three moments you are saying. There are completely different conditions. Are completely different, not only in our country but also internationally. I think so. I think that the possibility, the conditions also change your possibility of doing, and so you must change how to do things, even if you think the aims are the same, because the formats came immediately obsolete in this moment, and so it's necessary to continue thinking and, in a way, trying to be alert of the changes in society and changes in conditions, because the old formats are not, in a way, able to, or are not efficient to do what you intend to.
So you say the format that you used became obsolete. So can you say a bit more about that? What happened?
um, for example, I have to say something about that. For example, we thought at the moment that the working with the Central Union workers was a kind of a possibility to work with the class at that moment we thought would be the protagonist of a change, of a revolution, what that we thought was possible. And but immediately this possibility was closed, because I will tell you afterwards, because when the exhibition we did in Buenos Aires, this was censored and closed. So I think, for example, and so that was and this produced us to abandon art, because and because we thought the only possibility after that was political militance directly. But yes.
But if I talk about Argentina 2001, when I lived there, I think it was a very different situation. It was more a situation of, you could say, an implosion. The state disappeared, banks disappeared, there was no money. So there were only not also the galleries disappeared and the musea disappeared. So there were many. The only place where artists could show their work was the street. So artists started to organize exhibitions in shops, empty spaces, and so on. But also, because the economy at that moment was so dominant, the crisis was so dominant, many artists, they were reflecting on this. They were, it was not a choice. You had to deal with it, with the situation. Also for me, at that moment, it was clear that I had to, I think that was the moment that this work, Liquidation, started, and that started in a very simple way. I looked out of my window and I saw somebody opening my garbage and to take all the paper out of it and take it with him. So that was the starting point for me on that moment. And like me, many other artists started to work like this.
Yeah. And what kind of work did it trigger for you? How did you continue after that?
For me, it opened up the thought that you can, as an artist, you can also work in another way. You don't have to depend on an art market. You can also choose to relate yourself with social movements. At that moment, there were groups like GAC or etc. or situaciones who were relating directly to social movements, and that helped also other people to learn, well, you can also work as an artist like this.
So in a way, in '68 there was this over repression of the state that made it very difficult for you to like really engage in this struggle. And there was censorship. There were a lot of plans that you could not carry out because of the repression. And you came to Argentina in a time where the state was almost absent. Did that make it easier to relate as an artist to the social movements than in Graciela's time, or?
Well, I was, of course, a little bit in a different position, because as if you are working somewhere as a foreigner, you have another position. And so the strange thing was that for me in Argentina, it was quite easy to create a relationship with the cartoneers, for example. In fact, you could say for somebody from the middle class of Buenos Aires, it was much more difficult to create this relationship. At that moment, my Spanish was not that good, so they found me a quite interesting, strange figure who showed up in a certain moment, and they were teaching me Spanish, for example. That's why I still have that weird accent from time to time.
So Graciela, you already said that it was very difficult for you to work with the trade unions at the time. So what complicated that relationship?
Well, when we did Tucumán Arde in the together or inserted in the Central Union workers, we find no difficulty really. But what caused the difficulty is that we couldn't continue in that way, inserted in the programs of the Central Unions, because this path was closed by censorship, and because they in Buenos Aires there were no place for this kind of actions. But for many years I abandoned art field, and I came back in the late 90s, and when we began in 2003, during the crisis, we began a kind of an initiative, an artist initiative, with the sense of trying to think all over and to try to structure another way of doing in art, because conditions were completely different. And today I think we need to think it again, in a different reality.
So was it like you sort of you saw a new opening for this role as an artist, as a change maker in social struggles in the beginning of the 2000s, that you saw closed after Tucumán Arde? Was there a new opening that emerged for you? You left the art world, but you did decide to come back to art at that time.
Well, I think in a way, I am an optimist, and so I always think in the possibility. And if Tucumán Arde is important, I think also because it is like an example, I don't know, of a possibility of doing things not just inserted in art market and not respecting the institutional canons, but to do things differently, with trying to find a different language, a different public, a different places for doing art.
Yeah. So this search for new publics, new languages, I think that's really something that you also do in the work that you make now, in this period of crisis that we are in. You're also cooperating with trade unions, with activists from social movements. So how does that work for you in this current period of time?
Well, I think it's quite important that we start to think about how can we reshape our institutions. It is not a coincidence that I work in the Vakbond van Schoonmakers. Vakbond van Schoonmakers, as Marijn already explained, is completely connected with the idea of organizing. And organizing means that not only that you organize the union itself in another way, but also that you connect yourself with other kind of people, for example, like me as an artist. So it is not I think it's the decision of the Vakbond van Schoonmakers to organize themselves following the organizing method, is 100% related why I'm working there.
So can you say a bit more about this organizing method? What makes it work?
Organizing means that the power comes from below. That you, in organizing, the worker is the most important person in the organization. It's their voice where it starts and where it ends. So, for example, the opening what will happen in half an hour. One of the speakers will be my president, I say. My president is Khadija Ayati, is the president of the Union of Cleaners. She has been chosen by the Parliament of Cleaners. And it is also the Parliament of Cleaners who took the decision to invite me to make the trash museum.
So it's interesting because your the organizing method really originated in the 60s, right? And in a way, Graciela, for it also became a failure, right? The Tucumán Arde. It was very difficult to really engage in this collaboration with the cartoneros, with the people from Tucumán. There was censorship. There were lots of plans that you could not carry out. But you are using a method of organizing from that time, and nowadays it becomes really successful. Is that a sort of reinvention of the kind of strategies or tactics that you were using back in those days?
I don't know, but for example, cartoneros didn't exist in the 60s because crises. The living conditions during the crisis were much worse. But I don't know if I answer your question, but I think in a way Matthijs' way of working in art is like that he find out a way of doing and working together with the unions that was something we couldn't.
Maybe also important to say that I think the position of an artist inside a union is not only to create a campaign, but is also to create together with the workers their own visual identity. At this moment, if you look to the Dutch working class at this moment, this is I think it's quite difficult to say, well, how do they look now? For example, you have many different types of workers at this moment, and they don't feel that they consider themselves as part of a Dutch working class. At least I could say that I think together with, I'm not very important, I'm not the only person who's working inside the Union of Cleaners. There's also Marnix and Nina of the Tour. Cecilia worked also with us, with the domestic workers. So there are more than, there's a group of people who is working to at least what you could say to create the image of the Dutch cleaner in the Netherlands. And if I say nowadays, I think, what do you think if you see a fleck of yellow fabric, or if you see a yellow fist? Most of the people know what it means nowadays.
Yeah, exactly. I would like to collect some questions from the audience. Please respond. If you want to respond to Matthijs. Gaan we verder met...
Je wil die 3 blokken hebben of wil je in 1 keer door?
Ik wil in 1 keer door, denk ik, want we hebben...
Nee, je continue. Ja.
So, to apply our aims with Tucumán Arde, we decided that our insertion in the political struggle had to be realized through the CGT, the General Confederation of the Workers, that agglutinated the most radicalized sectors of the movement, and we assumed one of the points of its program as mobile of our work. This deterritorialization of artistic practice implied a new concept for the artwork, the need to think about research as part of it, the establishment of new spaces, the construction of new audiences, and insertion in another types of institutions. Issues that today are part of the strategies of many productions were not considered at the time in the artistic field, such as the use of photography and filming as documentary materials, recordings and interviews the inclusion of diverse actors like groups of students and workers as collaborators or as part of the collective. Here the images we are seeing belongs to the second part of the project that was, we call it the Publicity Campaign. We thought that as we have, or we want to address to other public, the common public of the street, we have to publicity our own works in a different work, in a different manner. So this campaign took place in different moments and in different places, articulated with the trip to Tucumán and the exhibition that took place afterwards. The first part was the poster you have seen with the word Tucumán. That was, the intention was to create just like a kind of curiosity or incognito of what that means. When part of the group was in Tucumán, making the register and all the documentation, appeared these graffitis saying Tucumán Arde. These were produced by students and some workers, and they were doing in clandestinity during the nights. And the second and the third part, we produced these posters with this legend, first biennial of avant-garde, and in order to put all this, or to introduce this action again in the art world, like a kind of protection of ourselves, that this was like art and not political. But the political thing was that the exhibition was held in the headquarters of the Central Unions, not in a museum, not in a gallery. And also we produced the sticker, the one that appeared before, that says Tucumán Arde, that were distributed among the central the student centers at the university, and so they were fixed everywhere. Yes, and then there is.
¿Quiere continuar con
well, the third part of the project, and that was in a way the moment where the action of counter-information was took place, were the exhibition in the Central Unions, first in Buenos Aires, in Rosario, and then in Buenos Aires. In Rosario, it lasted for almost near 2 weeks, and you can just see the images. We just used the building as it was. There was no white cube there, and we made by hand the enlargements of the photos, and also these kinds of diagram that we put on the floors, and also on like murals on the walls that were made by many of the collaborators, because so you can see the different calligraphies and know also another kind of aesthetics. This also reminds me, or makes a connection with the banners, the limpiadores produced with you. And so during the exhibition, the films and the images, the interviews we were able to make in Tucumán were shown here. And we have to take into consideration at this moment, political parties and political acts were prohibited. And so this became like really as a political act with a massive public presence. And it was activated by interviews to workers and students, and also addresses to some other and to all the senses, because we offer sugarless coffee, and the lights switch off at intervals to signify the death of a child. And so also at the entrance you have to walk on the through the names of the owners of the sugar mills, and in these diagrams you tried to make to show the connections between the owners of the sugar mills and the political power and the economic corporations. I think it's okay.
It's a beautiful image there. The previous one.
Yes, I'm going to read something, and that the closing of the exhibition in the CGT of Buenos Aires quickly closed this newly initiated path and put in crisis the assumptions that sustain our imaginary of work and political commitment with the working class. We could not find at this moment alternative answers to this newly opened road, a situation that led to the abandonment of art and the dissolution of the group. The option for the political meant the exodus from the artistic field and the commitment to militancy that often led to exile and even physical death. After the first moment of visibility in the 60s, Tucumán Arde was silenced during the second military coup that took place in the 70s, and it was only with the advent of democracy in 1984 that began to be recovered. Once again, it took force and visibility towards the end of the 90s and the beginning of the 2000s with the crisis, when the border situation that was going through the country updated similar concerns to those of the 60s, and many activist groups took Tucumán as a reference of their actions. Matthijs appeared.
Do you want to react, Matthijs? What strikes me in your story is that at first making this action or like proclaiming this action as art was a kind of protection also for the people involved, but it later on in the process it actually jeopardized the situation, because it became so politicized that it became clear that you were a threat to the authorities. So, do you want to react on that, Matthijs?
Well, nowadays, the situation is completely different. Working as an artist in the Netherlands, was not very dangerous. Mm-hmm. And I think the main problem that you have, that you will be neglected. I think that is the main problem what we have. And also, I think working.
But does it have advantages to put the sort of label of art on the stuff that you are doing, regardless of whether it's that it's completely different now and there is no like physical danger involved?
Oh, maybe this is a question you should ask to somebody of the union, because that is more interesting in a way. I always felt really welcome inside the Union of Cleaners, and I always felt really respected inside the union, and also I felt that that there was a need for have somebody like me inside the Union of Cleaners.
Yeah, to have this imaginary evolve, also the visual imaginary of the identity of the cleaners and the actions they're engaged in.
We have to change something, and also the union, the FNV, has to change itself, and they are working on it. And I think that for them, artists also can play a role in this.
Questions from you? Please raise your hand, and the mic is coming to you.
Thank you for your presentations, and I enjoyed much of the work that you made, and watching the images was very interesting for me. I have a question about the video you showed at the beginning, maybe a larger question about socialist art, a video that was commissioned by the Socialist Party, and you made it in dialogue with the people who were involved in the social struggle.
Well, the video was commissioned by Jonas Staal and was part of his Vrijdenkersruimte. The concept of Vrijdenkersruimte was that he invited a political party, and this political party, he did a project in Heerlen, and then he connected himself with the Socialist Party from Heerlen. One of the strongholds of the Socialist Party is Heerlen. And then Ron Meijer, who was at that moment the leader of the Socialist Party in Heerlen, contacted me, and we worked already together inside the Union of Cleaners to make it a bit more complicated.
So maybe would you like to say a little bit more about the relationship between the party and art, and the role of the artist in this?
It is not a coincidence, because it was also Ron Meijer who invited me to work for and with the workers inside the Union of Cleaners. He has been one of the people who was working to reshape the institution called the FNV for a very long time. And he also tried to do the same thing with the Socialist Party. Well, what happened there is another story. But if you look to Heerlen, to the Socialist Party in Heerlen, I think I respect them a lot, what they are doing. And also their idea of what is the position of art in our society, for them it is quite clear. So for them, they say art should have a strong, or should be completely connected with our society, and not only with one part of our society. So, for example, in Heerlen, you have a place called Schunk, that is the, let's say, the local cultural center, and they have an active policy on working inside the neighborhoods of Heerlen. So it is another way of thinking about what is art, what role can it play in a society?
Yeah, I am from FNV Domestic Workers Union, and we work in Matthijs. We have a campaign for the ratification of domestic work as real work, to be recognized as real work, because right now it's not recognized as real work. And definitely we need artists like Matthijs to make domestic workers who are invisible. We say they're invisible in that society. More than 300,000 of them work, but most of them, majority of them, have no papers, and so they work invisible, but they do some valuable work for that society. They work for people who are in government, even without papers, and employers know that they do not have papers. And we hope that the policymakers would recognize domestic work as real work. And Matthijs is, I think, doing a lot of service to the domestic workers in trying to make them visible with his art.
Thank you.
Maybe I can react to you. In one of the works you can see in exhibition is the work with the small notes. What is so interesting about this work is that originally it has been showed in the SMBA in Amsterdam. Then you ask, what do you do? Why do you are going to an art institute? There starts, I think also we can think about the whole idea of one foot inside, one foot outside. Because what is so in the struggle of the domestic workers, our allies are the employers that are not our enemies. The employer of the domestic worker is in fact our ally. Our enemy is the Dutch state, you could say, who make the people undocumented, who is not doesn't want to ratify the international conventions about domestic work. In order to create a connection with the employer, we took the decision to show a work inside a museum, because what is a place where an employer of a domestic worker feels at home? A museum.
So regarding this question of visibility, I think in a way you also made the situation in Tucumán visible for other audiences, right? Because in Tucumán was not only literally but also very symbolically far away from Rosario, from Buenos Aires at the time. So how do you look at this role of making certain things visible through art?
Well, in a way, it's like we were just talking, it's like given existence, no? And many times people have asked why we went to Tucumán. First, we went to Tucumán because it was one of the points of the program of struggle of the Central Union, but mainly because in our places in Rosario and Buenos Aires, the newspapers, the only thing that they report were that the sugar mills were closed, but they didn't tell what that means for the population, how they were starving, and how the precarious situation of the whole population. And so we thought that was a very important thing to do in our places.
I think we can collect like one or two questions from the audience still.
We have one here. My question is, in this period of where people participate in social media, the question of the artist as a tool for change, is that not more challenging now? Because how can you make a mark when everybody is trying to be an artist, uploading all sorts of films on YouTube? Isn't it more difficult for the artist to make a mark now that everybody's into social media?
Well, you're touching a very important question, because what are the criteria for a good artwork? If you connect this with the art market, it always has been quite clear, but especially with art, what they take place, let's say, outside what we consider as the art world, because I personally think my art world is huge, much bigger than let's say the so-called small art world. But outside, it becomes more difficult, because what is a good art? What is a good artwork? Are we talking about ethics? Are we talking about that it is serving the goal, or I think this is something we have to work on, I think, in the next years, to define a set of criteria of what we consider good art. Because if we just continue following the criteria what are there, I have my doubts. I think that that it could be useful.
Do you want to respond, Graciela?
Well, I totally agree with you, because in a way, international art is a kind of way of colonization too in our culture.
Could social media also be a way to democratize art? Or is that too optimistic?
Well, some people consider the social media also as part of the crisis we are living now in. And yes, in fact, let's say if you talk about organizing, social media plays a very important role. But on the other side, I think the side effects of social media, well, everybody deals with this, nearly an addiction to social media at this moment. And how can we create a more independent relationship with, let's say, the products of companies like Facebook, Google?
Are there more questions?
We have 2 more questions.
2 more? Okay.
I had a question for Graciela. And I was going to ask about an action you took in October 1968, which was to lock people in a gallery for a certain period of time, and it was it a bourgeois sort of petit bourgeois sort of audience, perhaps similar to the one we have here, and it took about an hour before people were released, but of course the people in the gallery themselves didn't release themselves. Someone from the outside broke a window so that people could get out. And I wanted to ask about then working with audiences like that, and how you've thought about that action and the result or failure of that action, and whether,
Thanks. And the second question?
Hi, Graciela. I had another question about what we were talking about the other day, about the archive you have assembled during the years. And I was wondering, your archive, I think, contains one of the key moments and key actions in what has been the history of art and activism in Latin America, but in general. And so many Latin American archives have been sold to major North American institutions or to major collections. So I was wondering if you could reflect a bit about what you see in the future for your archive. Do you have any ideas about what it could, where it could go to, what it could bring? And
Well, the first one says this action in October 1968 was part of a cycle we organized in the group, and that took place during from May to October 1968. And I think this work had to do with all the debates and conversations and concepts we were thinking at the moment. And I have also to say that it was in October, and 2 weeks after the encierro, we went to Tucumán for this. So we were immersed in this project of Tucumán. So we previously had a meeting to discuss what would be an engaged art, and we called it the first meeting of avant-garde. And we were talking about social art, revolutionary art, and all these kind of issues. And so what I thought was, what can I do? And what can I do not to make a representation, but to produce an event, to produce an action that would in a way affect the conscience of the audience, because and for me it was like a kind of metaphor of and first I had to become conscious of how oppression and censorship were working on us in our society during those times. And so I made this violence, conscious violence on the audience, as a way of they make aware in their own bodies of what was happening in society. And also like a hypothesis of that the only way of escaping or put a stop to this would be through action, through not continuing being just observers of reality, but to, in a way, transformed, and to produce your own liberation. This has to do with the ideas that were present in those days. And so for this, I think it was quite interesting. I didn't know what would happen. I didn't know what people would react. I just closed the people and went out. It was not a simulacrum. It was a really in person. So the people inside had to decide what to do, but at the same time, the people that came later for the opening was also there and were also part of the work, of the action, and also were they have to take a decision to be complices of that, just observers of the people inside in prison, or if they also took a positive action for ending this thing. So I don't consider it a failure. I just, for me, it's still a work that was important. It was important for me to do it, and also a very difficult, and it was because it was like using violence as a part of the artwork that works in that context. Nowadays, maybe it couldn't be done. And for Stephanie, about the archive, well, while being part of the group, in a moment we decided to play different roles and have different responsibilities. And I was designed to be like the press representative of the group, and I gather everything that was appearing in the press above the group, and also all other articles or news about the other groups or artists or works of art that or text that would serve or would be useful to these discussions and to this thinking of a new kind of art and a new place for the artist at that moment. And so when the group was dissolved, I still kept all these materials, and I continue during the the years after, continue gathering texts and photos and documents about torture, about repression in other parts of Latin America, etc. And well, in some moment, I also need to destroy some documents in order not to put some of our companions in danger of being in danger for if the militaries of the police were able to have these documents. And so we just for me it was impossible because the other members of the group just destroyed all that had to do with these moments, but it was impossible to me to do this because affective reasons. Really never thought this action would be known or be present during the following years. And so after in the 90s, where the first researchers became looking for materials, we found out that it was the only archive or the only documents that were preserved. And so, well, in this way, it came to visibility. And at the same time, many researchers also put together with the artists, put into visibility other archives in Latin America that were of actions that were not known until that moment. So, answering your question, I think this work with the archive and so how to reactivate it and also to keep memory and about those actions and works. I think the archives have a big importance to also construct a different story and not or a different history of art and of social history too. And also we there is now that those actions of and this kind of yes on the 60s that are nowadays are in the art market too, and there is a need to preserve those sources in our own places, and this is not easy because we have there is no policies, state policies for this, and so many of these archives are bought for this by the central countries and disappearing from our own countries. So this is like a fight we have to do in.
And still, thanks to your archive, we can have this conversation today. So I want to thank you very much, Matthijs, Graciela. And I want to give the floor to Matteo Lucetti for some closing remarks.